Murphy, thank you very much indeed. And good morning individually or otherwise. The doorbells, I'm afraid, will keep going for a little while as people join us a little late, which is inevitable. But thank you so much for making the time to come on this member briefing this morning, which of course precedes our AGM at 12 o'clock. And this is the first member briefing and definitely the first AGM that I've done by Zoom. So we are a little bit in uncharted territory here. We've obviously used Zoom calls for member meetings, but nothing that's going to be quite as large as this. So we are keeping everything we've got crossed, fingers and everything else, that all goes according to plan. And in that spirit, of course, the day didn't quite start as I planned because about 40 minutes ago, I lost power. And thus I'm speaking to you from a mobile phone connection. And I'm actually going to change the plans a little bit, and Neil's going to run the majority of this session so that I've got adequate power on my mobile device to be able to conduct the AGM in the event that the electricity doesn't come back on by 12 o'clock. You really couldn't make it up, as somebody once said in the Daily Mail. So we're going to stop for a natural break if we can at around 10 to 12.
Join the meeting.
10 to 12, 5 to 12, we'll stop for a break between this meeting and the AGM, just to give everybody a chance to refresh their cups, visit the bathroom and so on and so forth. You don't need to dial in again for the AGM. The same connection will keep you with us all the way through till about 12:30 when this morning's proceedings will be over. So thank you once again for joining. If you want to talk to us, ask us questions, make comments, it's not going to be that easy for obvious reasons, because with such a large audience, by definition, doing things this way is nothing like as easy to manage as it would be when we have you in a room, as we normally do. And we actively try to encourage, as you know, at these member briefings that precede AGMs every year, the opportunity for members to ask questions so that we can get a dialogue and a conversation going. We'll do our best to do that by this method. There are two simple ways really that you can ask us questions or make comments or let us know that you want to say something. One is to use the chat facility. I imagine by now most of you have become used to how Zoom and Teams and other things like this work. So either use the chat facility or raise a hand, wave a hand, or whatever it is on Zoom to let us know that you want to say something. And one of us will make sure that you get picked up if we can over the course of the next 80 minutes or so. So in the times that, in a sign at least, that even though the coronavirus pandemic is clearly still ongoing, and as you would have gathered from yesterday's announcements, we're definitely not out of the woods as yet. We now have the power of 6 to deal with as of next Monday. I gather that S Club 7 are no longer going to be able to reform in any time in the near future. None of the dwarfs are happy, not even happy this morning apparently, but those are my two worst jokes of the morning out of the way early on. So in a sign that some business things are beginning to return to normal, that said, the housing market is clearly pretty buoyant at the moment for reasons that I'm sure we will talk about. And the government is very much focused back on some domestic issues, including housing, as a consequence of the publication of some pretty wide-ranging proposals in their planning papers that have come out over the last month or so. And so this morning we're going to try to tackle planning. We're going to talk about policy. We're going to talk about quality, technical issues, the environmental challenge, skills and cities. This is all time permitting. We've sketched this out as best we can so that it will fit between now and 10 to 12 thereabouts. But of course, if we don't get everything covered, please forgive us and we'll pick it up at our next member briefing. So that's it from me for now. I'm going to go radio silent. I'll be here listening intently, but not watching for a little while. And I'm going to hand over to Neil Jefferson, our Managing Director, of course, who joined us since our last AGM, came in to HBF from NHBC back in January, a real baptism of fire, and barely got his feet under the table when we had to close the office. I'm not sure Neil ever thought that his start at the helm of HBM would look quite like that, but there you go, things happen, and I'm delighted with the way both Neil and the whole HBF team has responded to the coronavirus pandemic, and I know from the comments I've had from a number of you that you're very appreciative of the hard work and effort that the team have put in as well. So Neil, over to you to run the first part of today's events, please. You're on, and Neil, in the traditional words of 2020, you're on mute.
Yeah, and there's the first pound in the pot for the day. So thanks, Stuart. I'll maybe come back with a bit of a summary at the end, but I'll get the agenda underway by introducing a lineup of speakers in a moment. I'll start with Andrew Whitaker. But I just wanted to say a bit more about HBF's response to the coronavirus pandemic. I'll just provide a brief summary of the key activities we've taken to support HBF members since the start of the coronavirus. In terms of the office, like many organisations with London offices, we decided to close our office, and we've all been working from home or remotely since 17th of March, and I've got to pay tribute to my colleagues for how well they've dealt with that. We will be reopening HBF House more formally from next month, but for the time being, we expect it to be well below capacity. With regards meetings, we're all getting used to the doorbell from Zoom and using Microsoft Teams as well. And as Stewart mentioned, since the early days of the pandemic, engagement's been key. And we've worked extensively to keep members informed on fast-moving developments, to understand the challenges members are facing across a wide range of issues, and to articulate those concerns. We've tried to ensure that our communication with members is effective and efficient as possible by holding conference calls, issuing briefings, which were daily initially, and we launched a dedicated coronavirus resource page on our website. I should make very special mention of the member video conferences, which have been very exceptionally well attended and held very frequently. These groups include the national groups, and you'll know those are small developers, Metropole, mid-cap and majors, the regional managing director groups across the country, associate members, HR directors, national finance directors, and others. Now, the frequency has been increased massively. Most have been held fortnightly and 3 weekly initially. And just to give you an idea, on Monday, we're holding our 9th National Small Developers Group meeting in the 6 months since lockdown. In more normal times, most national group meetings meet 3 or 4 times a year. So while we're looking forward to face-to-face and, of course, dinner meetings, especially with the promise of some decent wine from Stewart, video conferencing will be a part of our business and a key offering to members going forward. There's no doubt about that. It's worked extremely well. With regards to working practices, it was the input, feedback and collaboration from those member meetings that enabled us to develop protocols to enable sites to operate safely and respect the social distancing rules and guidance from Public Health England. The announcement from government on the 12th of May with regards to restarting the housing market, and the show of public support from ministers for the Charter for Safe Working Practice that we developed jointly with MHCLG was especially welcome for us all. Now, more than 100 HBF members, including all the majors and mid-cap members, signed up to support the Charter, together with a long list of allied organisations. And I think the reopening of sales was particularly well received, and the work we did on the sales side, particularly on protocols, meant that government was able to announce on 12th of May that developers could meet with customers, reopen sales offices and show homes, and undertake viewings, and that was all extremely significant. I think maybe only a few of us would have heard of the Construction Leadership Council prior to the COVID crisis. But I think it's fair to say that since the onset, the CLC quickly moved to set up a task force to coordinate and guide desirable actions for the sector, and we played a central part in that. Initially, and John Slaughter bears the scars for this, the task force met daily to review actions and develop and implement new ones according to identified needs. I think we're all very aware of the CLC site operating procedures, which were an integral part to our charter, but there's also been some excellent work done in terms of product availability, making sure that materials are available through merchants and elsewhere, and also, of course, the operation of the government's job retention scheme. We've also held regular conversations with numerous stakeholders, including utility providers, material suppliers, and all the ancillary trades, to ensure the supply chain is in a good position and has been in a good position to respond to the crisis. As a result, I think, of our input into the CLC and the task force, the CLC has actually restructured itself and created 4 new groups, one of which is the Housing Working Group. And we were asked by the CLC to run that group, which is now very much up and running. Just turning finally, with regards to our response to the coronavirus pandemic, to economic recovery. In responding to the pandemic, HBF prepared an economic recovery plan, setting out suggested steps and packages that government could take to ensure stability and provide confidence to the sector, a playbook, if you like. And I won't steal the thunder of my colleagues who are presenting after me, but just to list out a few of the measures that we raised with officials and others in those early days and now, since the pandemic. We've talked about access to finance, whether at the various levels that those business interruption loans come in and some of the difficulties that members have had accessing them. We've talked about planning. We made the case for an extension to working hours, extensions to extant planning applications. Speaking of extensions, I think the extension to Help to Buy recognising the delays on site this year because of slower productivity and sites closing has been another success. We talked about the role of stamp duty reductions and how that could boost the market, and that came possibly slightly earlier than expected. And those have led into a variety of other announcements that colleagues will talk about today, and I'll hand over to Andrew in a moment to talk in more detail about what's going on in the world of planning. So I mentioned that we've responded in terms of member meetings to working online in these new formats. This also posed quite a challenge for our subsidiary organisation, House Builder Media. We run some fantastic events throughout the year, HMI, the Policy Conference, the awards. And of course, through 2020, we've been unable to gather in those ways, but we do hope to get back at some point in the future. What we have done is we've turned to run live webinars. So we held the first of these in front of more than 700 of our members, and including Robert Jenrick on 11th of June this year. We've run 2 of those, they've both been very successful, and we're using the same format for our planning conference and technical conference, which are being held next week on the 15th and 16th respectively. And again, we've got a huge attendance of members attending those virtual meetings. So it's been an exceptionally busy period for HBF, during which, like everybody else, we've been adapting and responding to working from home and holding meetings via video conference. And I'm very grateful to all the support we've had from members and from colleagues during that time. So in terms of this part of the agenda and the executive update, I'll just turn now to Andrew Whitaker to give us an update on what's happening in the world of planning. Over to you, Andrew.
Thanks very much, Neil, and good morning, everyone. The agenda gives me 15 minutes to tell you about the most radical reform to the planning agenda since the Second World War, according to the Prime Minister. So here we go, we'll give it a go. There are currently, as you're probably more aware, 2 consultations out at the moment, one on the existing planning system and what's called a planning white paper. I shall come to that in a moment, but the existing consultation is very important because these are the changes that the government is going to make this autumn. It has some quite far-reaching impacts on the industry. The first is the standard methodology for calculating housing need. There's been quite a lot of discussion about this amongst what's being called the geek groups, people who do demographics for a living, and chat amongst themselves about what the best methodology is to come up with the right number of houses in the right places. Certainly my view is more, you know, the numbers are what the numbers are, and local authorities will have to plan for them, which is all well and good until you get to some of the anomalies within the figures, such as the new standard methodologies output for London, where the figures using the proposed current methodology is about 90,000 houses a year. Now, those of you who deal with London will know that London output is way below that, a third of that, at not more than 30,000 dwellings a year. So I think there are some concerns about that, because London has historically been very poor at cooperating with the Shire counties and moving its unmet needs into the Shire counties. And of course, in a reverse way, the Shire counties are not as keen to take London overspill as perhaps they were in the 60s and 70s. There are challenges to the standard methodology. It's a very brave move by the government. Certainly it hits the home counties in the southeast much harder in terms of an increased housing number for those authorities to deal with. And of course, that's the very heartlands of the Conservative power base. So there's been already quite a lot of friction. And we've seen the Housing Minister and Robert Jenrick say, oh, well, you know, we might have some tweaking to the standard methodology. So already they seem to be rowing back a little bit on that. The affordable housing threshold proposed in the consultation, again, is a bit of a surprise. A very high threshold is proposed, below which developments won't have to make a contribution towards affordable housing. The consultation paper talks about 40 or 50 dwellings, and that would account for about 70% of all housing sites not making a contribution to affordable housing. So that's why it's quite surprising. Again, you're going to see some kickback from affordable housing providers, affordable housing charities. Shelter have already put their tanks on the lawn and said that they aren't going to support this and that developers should be doing more, not less. But the proposal is for a temporary period to encourage economic recovery and certainly to help smaller developers. First Homes is out there to try and help first-time buyers. It's a discounted market sale product only available to first-time buyers, and that will have to form part of the affordable housing contribution on sites. I kind of like the juxtaposition between increasing the threshold of sites that don't need to provide affordable housing while still requiring first home a portion of that affordable housing, but that's just me. The idea of First Homes is to give first-time buyers a discount against full market value of 30%, with the opportunity for local authorities through the local plan process to increase that to 40 or 50% discount. It's important to remember that it's not any range between 30 and 50. It's 30, 40 or 50% discount, and that anything above 30% has to go through the local plan. The fourth change that will happen in the autumn is the extension of permission in principle. Again, rather curiously, a permission in principle doesn't give you a permission. It is a way of establishing the principle of development on a site in the way that those of you that are old enough will remember red line applications around sites where you said, can I develop this site for housing? So it's a way of going back to that. If you have permission in principle, you only need to submit a technical details application, which is like a reserved matters application. So although they are two different regimes, and that's to get around some legal requirements of the amount of information that you need, they are very different. But the extension of permission in principle to sites of up to 150 dwellings, I think will be worthwhile some of you looking into and seeing whether you can take advantage of a permission in principle rather than going through an outline and reserved matters process. So on to the white paper, and people are all saying, well, this isn't much of a white paper. It's actually more of a green paper, or indeed more of a discussion policy paper. This sets out the proposals of the government to make this radical change to the planning system, and it's predicated on what a lot of people saw coming because of the appointment of Jack Airy as the Housing and Planning Advisor to Number 10. So the big change is that development plans will change from being very large documents that repeat national policy to being very slim documents, which essentially map the whole of the land within the local authority area into 3 zones. They will be growth zones, renewal zones, or protection zones, all poorly named in my opinion. Growth zones used to be called allocations, I suppose, strategic allocations. Renewal areas are existing developed areas, so if you like, areas inside settlement boundaries. And protection zones, although some protection zones won't allow development, we know about those. Things like Green Belt will still allow you to make an application for development in them, as long as you continue to protect the thing that's being protected. So Green Belt, the openness of the Green Belt is something that we're all familiar with. Being able to protect an SSSI is slightly more difficult, of course. So the development plan will take precedent. If you're in a growth zone, i.e. you've got an allocation, you will have to do very little to make an application in those areas. You will be assumed that that development is going to go ahead, and people won't be allowed to challenge the principle of development because it will be in the local plan. In renewal areas, you will have to make an application, and in protection areas, as I say, you'll have to show how you're going to continue to meet that protection. A very different kind of development plan in the future. And development management is going to be dealt with at a national level. The government is going to write national development management rules, and although local authorities will be able to write some of their own rules, those are supposed to be kept to a minimum. Which takes me on to the second pillar of the white paper, which is beauty. This is the government's response to the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, and rolls forward their design agenda. So the idea behind Building Beautiful is that local authorities will be able to write design codes for their local areas, local communities will be able to write design codes for their areas, and those design codes will be applied to applications that come forward for development. As I say, a huge amount of detail is not in the white paper. So how to write a design code is being dealt with separately. You may recall the design guide that MHCLG put out at the end of last year. It seems such a long time ago now, but they put out the design guide and flagged that they were going to write a national design code, telling people how to write their own design codes. And that work is currently ongoing, so we haven't seen the output from that. So people don't really know what's going to be in a design code or how detailed the design code needs to be. But the proposal in the white paper is that if you meet the design code, you should get planning permission as quickly as possible. The third issue in the white paper is the age-old debate of how to ensure that development pays for necessary infrastructure. And the proposal of the infrastructure levy is a single payment to a local authority, including affordable housing contributions, that the local authority will then spend on the necessary infrastructure to support the development in its locality. Very, very similar to the original idea of community infrastructure levy. The proposals in the white paper don't address all of the problems that people have had with the community infrastructure levy. It's also unfair to suggest that this was the outcome of the SIL review, because although the SIL review did say that all development should pay a levy based on the gross development value of development, it sat that alongside site-specific infrastructure provision. So the government have really only picked up on one of the recommendations of the SIL review and not reinstated the other. In fact, they've blatantly said that Section 106 will be withdrawn, and that site-specific infrastructure will be in kind and offset against the infrastructure levy charge. So there's a long way to go on this white paper. It will require primary legislation if everything happens. It will require a lot of secondary regulations, and you're looking at least 12 to 18 months for the primary legislation, and then at least another 6 months for the secondary legislation. So you are not going to have a new planning system for at least 18 months, more likely 2 years, more likely closer to 3 years. And that's important because we need the government to be realistic about how quickly this change is going to happen, because we want local authorities to carry on as business as usual. There will be a temptation for local authorities to down tools on current local plans, to down tools on making big decisions about reviewing greenbelt land, for example, because they know that coming over the hill is a new system. They don't know the detail of that new system because that hasn't been set out yet, but they will grasp on the idea that a new system may be better for them than the old system, and therefore if you have to take a difficult decision today, why would you do that if you thought that the new system was going to be better? So our message to government at the moment is make sure that local authorities continue with business as usual. I've taken most of the time on those two consultations because those are current issues, but there are still lots of other current issues. Biodiversity net gain, the production of nature recovery plans, how the industry deals with that. That's a very important consultation, and one which we might take some heart from the other consultations on, in that if the government is trying to make the system easier, then making biodiversity net gain an easy process for developers to follow and meet the requirements should be part of that process. A lot of people have started talking again about that age-old problem of the burden of regulation, the mounting up of lots of change on the industry and the cost of that change on the industry being an overall burden. So nothing in itself is too bad, but everything cumulatively is. But I actually think that the burden is on local planning authorities. There is a huge amount in this planning change arena that will require local authorities to do things very, very differently. And they will need to gear up their staff to retrain, to relearn how to plan properly, not be so focused on development management, and to plan for the future through the development plan system. The only other thing I've got time for, Neil, is to re-plug the planning conference next Tuesday. We're very pleased that we've got the new Chief Planner, Joanna Averley from MHCLG. She replaced Steve Quartermain at the beginning of this month as Chief Planner, and she is coming along to give the government's keynote speech on planning change. So if you have very specific questions about planning change, I recommend you sign up to that conference. Otherwise, I think I've hit my time limit, Neil, first time ever, but I'll be able to take a couple of questions now.
There's a palpable surprise there, Andrew. Very well done. Covered a huge amount of ground very quickly. There is just one question on the chat from Steve Midgley, which I think you may have covered off on. Do we know yet, Andrew, when we're going to be able to apply for permission in principle?
Well, that will come in. The permission in principle regime is already in place in legislation. It's just changing the threshold. So the government will change their threshold after the consultation period is over. So the consultation on that runs until the 1st of October. The government will respond to the consultation. So my guess is, Steve, that you're looking at some time towards the end of October when you'll be able to make PIPs on much larger developments than the 10 units that you're currently allowed to. So sometime between the end of October and the end of the year, but it will take a written ministerial statement to do that.
That's great. Thanks, Andrew. Okay, well, I'll just give you, colleagues on the call, just give you an idea of we're on item 3 here, key industry issues. We've heard from Andrew. Just to let you know what's coming up today, we've got David O'Leary will talk in a moment about Help to Buy, and Steve Turner's on the call as well. You'll know that Steve's been leading HBF and Industries work on the New Homes Quality Board and the Ombudsman, so we'll hand over to Steve. Kieran Walker, HBF's Technical Director, is here as well, and there's a few things that Kieran will cover. We're awaiting news on some very key consultations that Kieran will talk about. Also, HBF's work on the environment agenda is really back up and running again. Has been put on the back burner for a few months, something we kicked off in January, and John Slaughter will give you the highlights of that. Jenny Herdman is here. Jenny runs a Home Building Skills Partnership. It's been a very busy year for the partnership, and Jenny will give an update. And then hopefully we'll have time to hear from James Stevens with regards to the work we do on devolved government and with cities. So that's the lineup today. So I will keep rolling. I'll introduce now someone who I'm sure you'll know, David O'Leary, who's our Policy Director. Now, if Help to Buy is a key driver for a 93% increase in housing supply seen in recent years. So unsurprisingly, it's remained a key focus for HBF throughout 2019. HBF sought to ensure the industry has been able to make its representations on the new scheme, which I know you will all know comes in from 2021 and runs until 2023, analysing the potential impact of regional price caps and so on, and working with a range of government officials and advisors. So we're continuing to engage with government about the impacts that Help to Buy has, and particularly the price caps have, and we've got an opportunity through the forthcoming comprehensive spending review to make our case again. So without covering too much ground that David will cover now, I'll hand over to David.
Thanks, Neil. I think I'll just use my slot here really to update on a few recent developments with Help to Buy, and also I think maybe just reflect a bit on what some of that means for the industry and for us kind of going forwards beyond Help to Buy as well, and looking out towards the sort of end of the new scheme, which will come in 2023. So the extension that we got announced back in July, I think, was pretty critical. This was the extension to the practical completion deadlines that had been causing so much concern, and not just amongst builders and lenders, but also amongst home buyers who had been contacting us in their droves as well. and had been contacting their MPs and all of that sort of thing. It's something that we've been in discussions with government and with Homes England about for more than 12 months, actually, because even when the first announcement was made about the new scheme, the 3-month transition between the current scheme and the new scheme always seemed like an unnecessarily long window. And obviously that was accentuated by the fact that we had such a hiatus in housing delivery during the kind of early months of the pandemic. So that practical completion deadline has been extended from the end of December this year to the end of February next year. So it's an extra couple of months in which to get homes completed. And then there is an additional further extension for homes that were reserved prior to June 2020, can now push out their legal completion deadline until the end of May. More recently, we've had the kind of information that we've been looking for from Homes England now for some time, again, probably more than a year, on the developer guidance and the scheme requirements for the new scheme that goes live next year in April. I think as much of it is as expected. We knew there would be more requirements, more conditions on that for developers. It's obviously something that we've seen over the past few years, that secretaries of state, and started really with Sajid Javid's trying to use Help to Buy as a means by which to get developers and the industry more generally to uphold certain behaviours and that type of thing. So we saw it particularly around leasehold, and that's reflected in the new rules that will come forward for the new scheme. So references to the HBF customer satisfaction rating, references to the new homes ombudsman and compliance with that, and likewise on building regulations. I think that we know for some time government has been concerned that homes are being built to previous building regulations, in particular with regards to energy efficiency. Those concerns have been heard loud and clear, and there is going to be a requirement in there which hasn't existed previously for more contemporary building regulations to be adhered to. We've got a few questions on that and the practicalities of it that we're discussing with government and with Homes England, but by and large that is the direction of travel, and it isn't a surprise. I think probably the biggest development in terms of the new scheme and the biggest concern we have is around the timescales for that scheme. We'd originally hoped that it would be open for developers to take reservations on by the end of this summer, really, so definitely by now. The current timetable from Homes England sees builders probably not getting fully under contract with Homes England until at least mid-October, but more likely November, December. And there is therefore some potential for a hiatus in housing delivery where developers potentially don't have stock to sell under the current scheme, but the new scheme won't yet be open. So I think from HBF's perspective, and this was reflected on another call that just this morning with Homes England, I think our advice, our guidance, if you like, would be to fully digest all of the documentation that's out there as quickly as possible and be ready to submit forecasts and documentation back to Homes England pretty much as soon as you can, because I think that's more likely to get you to the front of the queue and be able to access that scheme in November rather than the end of December. But I think I just kind of wanted to end really by sort of reflecting on what all of this means for the industry. I think what we've seen over the pandemic period has been that the government has bent over backwards really, and really strived to provide assistance to the sector to keep the show on the road. SEAL and Section 106 deferrals, the site operating procedures through the CLC that Neil mentioned earlier, the stamp duty holiday that Neil also mentioned, and ministers were obviously very quick to reopen the housing market during lockdown. But then I think reflecting on that in the context of Help to Buy is interesting. The scheme extension, which on the face of it was a bit of a no-brainer, and it was really popular with customers, real electors, voters. It was announced in a very peculiar way for a government that knows how to work the media. You might think it was released on at about 5:30 on a Friday evening in July, i.e. when no one could hear about it or no one could make too much of noise about it. And I think that probably tells us all we need to know about the government's attitude to Help to Buy. And in the long run, that probably means that we need to do more work, as we talked about probably at this session in person last year, to look at what those private alternatives to Help to Buy are. And that's something that we're on with members in various guises. And I think we'll be hearing a lot more about over the next few months and into early next year. And you'll be hearing a lot more from us, I think.
Thanks, David. That's great. Does anybody have any questions for David on Help to Buy, or maybe some of the other work that we're doing on the policy work that David mentioned there towards the end of his presentation? Any questions? We can always come back at the end if we have time, but if there's anything that anyone wants to respond to in what David said, this is the good time. Okay. Well then, David, that's great. Thank you very much indeed. I'll turn to our next presenter now. Again, someone that you'll all know very well, Steve Turner, who's our Communications Director at HBF. As I mentioned a few moments ago, Steve's also been spearheading work on the New Homes Quality Board and quality generally, and it's been great that we've had the New Homes Quality Board established this year. So here to give us, bring us right up to speed with where work is on the New Homes Quality Board, New Homes Ombudsman, and maybe more broadly with regards to our media work, it's Steve Turner.
Thanks, Neil. As people will know, this is an agenda we've been working on for 4 years or so now, since the publication of the first APPG report into build quality was made, the #1 recommendation of which was for a New Homes Ombudsman. And we started work underneath the group we set up underneath the chairmanship of Stephen Stone. Since then, it's become apparent it's something very clearly government is committed to, and they want to see a New Homes Ombudsman come into being as soon as possible. And that was most recently restated in the Building Safety Bill we saw a couple of months back, which is currently out for consultation. We've worked with a broad range of stakeholders to develop an industry or sector-led solution that both meets government requirements, but also is, crucially from our perspective, workable for industry. And we're on target now to see a New Homes Ombudsman introduced next year. In May this year, we launched the interim New Homes Quality Board, which is the body we're responsibility for overseeing this moving forward. Natalie Elphick, MP, is chair of that. It was a natural succession, having been appointed by us last year as the New Homes Quality Champion. The board comprises of reps from a range of bodies, including lenders, warranty providers, conveyancers, consumers, and bodies such as Homes England, and has 3 builders on there, a large, medium and small, to make sure the industry is represented as these proposals develop. Douglas Cochrane, who I know many of you know, is the deputy chair and is helping drive a lot of the work forward. Work is currently in 3 main areas. The first is the structure, and the legal structure of the New Homes Quality Board is now in place and ready to be constituted, consisting of a main board with a number of advisory committees underneath it. The second part of the work is to do with the new code of practice, that is basically an amalgamation of the existing consumer codes that are out there, with a number of additional responsibilities in it, primarily for builders in years 1 and 2, to do with ensuring that builders have effective complaints procedures in place and are dealing effectively with issues in those first 2 years, which, as we know, is where the industry has faced a lot of criticism over recent years. The new code's about ready to go out to consultation, initially to industry in the coming weeks, and we HBF, through the New Homes Quality Board, will be setting up a number of workshops for builders to explain where the changes lie in terms of between the existing code and the new code. The third main area of work is to do with the appointment of an Ombudsman service that will provide adjudication against the code, and we've been working with the Ombudsman Association on the tender and commissioning process for that is now quite well advanced. I think a number of key areas are starting to emerge, in particular the customer journey, and we've got a group now set up comprising a number of builders and NHBC, looking at how customers are navigated through the new arrangements from the builder to the warranty provider in terms of their resolution service, and then ultimately to the Ombudsman service. I think the main requirement of that is that the builder is going to have to own that complaint throughout the process, and obviously the ambition is to minimise as far as possible the number of referrals to an Ombudsman service. We've kept government up to speed with developments as these have progressed to ensure it aligns with their thinking, and all indications are that government sees this as the vehicle to delivering its ambition or commitment for a new Homes Ombudsman service, and indeed what was published in the Building Safety Bill aligns with how we are progressing arrangements. We're also speaking to the Welsh and Scottish governments, and they will be involved in one of the advisory committees to the board, and they're positively on side in terms of how we're progressing things. So we're hopefully on target to launch an Ombudsman service early in the new year. There'll then be a transition period for builders to sign up to the new arrangements of between 6 and 12 months, we envisage. The Building Safety Bill will allow government ultimately to make it mandatory for builders to sign up to an Ombudsman scheme. And as David just said, the new Help to Buy scheme will require participating builders to sign up to an Ombudsman scheme. So clearly the ambition is to get 100% market coverage as far as possible for builders to sign up. Funding will be is expected to be through the industry in the same way that the industry pays for the current consumer codes. Presumably we envisage on a per house levy basis. I think the only other related piece of work on that is that the code will allow for a pre-completion inspection if the customer wishes to take one out. And so we're working with RICS and the Residential Property Surveyors Association on what a template inspection can look like, which will be against existing standards, NHBC Chapter 9, etc. And also how we ensure the inspectors carrying out those surveys are suitably qualified, and that the snagging firms are suitably regulated. So I think that's where we are in terms of the new Homes Ombudsman proposals, and obviously happy to take any questions on that. Changing hats in terms of media, clearly despite the domination currently of coronavirus and Brexit on the news agenda, I think it's clear that housing will remain near the top of that agenda, and the spotlight will return to our industry. Throughout the coronavirus crisis, huge interest in terms of when builders were stopping work, and then when builders were starting work again. And indeed, we worked with members over a lot of concerns for how the media was going to portray the return to work and potentially look at unsafe practices. Planning has also featured highly recently, as you'll be aware, and build quality indeed. And we've looked to work with members on responding to those as they come in. The image of the industry clearly is something we've discussed at length in the past, and something we're working on to improve. And as we develop work on the Ombudsman and on the environment, which John will come on to shortly, that will give us options to more positively position the industry moving forward, we hope. In terms of campaigns, we've following the polling work we did of stakeholders and the public last year about the perceptions of the industry, we've launched a number of initiatives. We held a skills event in Parliament pre-lockdown that was very well attended by MPs, and a number of representatives from our members to talk about the positive skills and opportunities within the industry. And we've got a virtual event on the 17th of March 17th of this month to look to launch the Building Communities report that highlights the very positive contribution development makes to local communities. We also held New Homes Week pre-summer, a social media campaign that was looked to support the industry post work restarting, and gave us some positive opportunity to put messages about new homes out there through the celebrity ambassador Sophie Robinson on a number of radio interviews and TV interviews and newspaper reports, and we got very positive social media traction on that. So we will continue to work with members via the marketing and communications group we have and other groups to continue to respond reactively to the media stories as they emerge, but also hopefully moving forward to increasingly look to get on the front foot and positively position the industry as some of the work initiatives that we've started start to bear fruit. So I think that's all I need to say, Neil. Thank you.
That's great, Steve. So covering off there, the work on the New Homes Quality Board, also media and campaigns, and undoubtedly been a very busy year before we add on the additional work that's been carried out in respect of responding to the pandemic. So any questions for Steve on any of that? There's a lot covered there. Clearly the New Homes Quality Board is a long way to go there, but making very good progress as Steve has outlined. Any questions for Steve before we move on? Feel free to use the chat as you've been doing. We can pick up questions out of sequence if needed, or come back at the end. Okay. Thanks again, Steve. So turning to our next speaker today, Kieran Walker, who's our technical director at HBF. Kieran will give us an update now on building regulation and technical matters that we're facing into, and probably one or two frustrations about overdue consultations, I would expect. Kieran, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Neil. Good morning, everybody. So this year, like the last, has been unprecedented with the announced. So I'm on mute. Sounds like I'm on mute. No, I'm not on mute. Okay, apologies. Sorry, this year, like the last, has been unprecedented with the significant amount of regulatory change announced. In the 12-month period since the last AGM, we've seen the government's proposals for the implementation of 3 major changes to primary legislation affecting the design, build and occupation of new dwellings. These being, of course, the Future Homes Standard, electric vehicle charging points, the Building Safety Bill amendments to Part B. That list, of course, is not exhaustive. There's many other regulatory changes happening in the background, but today I just wanted to give an overview of where those 3 key factors are, if I can. So starting first with the Future Homes Standard. During the spring budget statement in March 2019, the then Chancellor of the Exchequer announced that by 2025, all new homes would be fossil fuel free, that a consultation on a revised set of building regs would follow. In late 2019, a consultation of an amended approved document Part L and F, titled the Future Homes Standard, was launched, which set out the government's proposals for 2 options on how to reduce emissions and energy consumption on new dwellings by 2025. Option 1 is a 20% reduction in overall emissions and was largely reliant on fabric efficiencies within the construction of new properties. Option 2, a 31% reduction in emissions and relied heavily on technologies such as air source heat pumps and ground source heat pumps to achieve this reduction. Conversely, across the border in Wales, the devolved government set even higher percentage reduction targets, utilising a similar rationale to achieving this. A number of workshops and wide stakeholder engagement sessions were held by HBF in order to respond to comprehensively and representatively to the consultation in February 2020, with the overall view that in England, due to a number of critical factors, including the current availability of heat pumps, the availability of electrical capacity within existing networks, and the supply of skilled tradespeople to install, calibrate and commission heat pump networks, that option 1 should be the immediate target of the industry. This was, however, caveated by the desire to step up to option 2 over a 2 to 3 year period, and that transitional arrangements for the implementation of this significant step change in building regulations should be set at 12 months. Following the closure of the consultation in February, HBF met with 8 Shields officials, who had received the industry's proposals positively and also agreed with the stance that the lack of maturity in supplier industries currently is a major impediment to the successful delivery of Future Homes Standard. parting position left with MHCLG was that the industry supports these proposals. However, it is imperative that major investment and incentives are required by government in these ancillary supply markets in order for the proposals to be adopted on a nationwide basis. Following our meeting in March with governmental officials and the subsequent pandemic, there has as yet been no meaningful update to the government's preferred position, nor the likely timescale for implementation of the revised building regs. We've been made aware that there were over 4,000 individual consultation responses, and that a subsequent overheating consultation is to be launched by MHCLG in October this year, and that the consultation response will be published this autumn. Following Andrew's lead, I've also going to plug the HBF Technical Conference. We have Francis Kerwin, who's the Deputy Director of MHCLG's Building Regulation Implementation Team, presenting an update at the HBF National Technical Conference on the 16th of September. Francis will be giving an update on Part L and F, Part B, building safety, as well as electric vehicle charging points, which brings me nicely on to the next point. So in the autumn of 2019, we also saw the closure of the OLEV, Office for Light Emission Vehicles consultation on the mandatory requirement for electric vehicle charging points in every new dwelling. Based upon the growing uptake of electric vehicles and underneath the overarching emerging environmental legislation, this proposed new building regulation, Part S, setting out that every new property will require a minimum 7 kilowatt charging point accessible by the occupant of the home. Similar to the approach adopted to the Future Home Standard, HBF undertook a number of wide stakeholder engagement sessions to reflect the views of the industry on this subject and lobbied for a passive approach to the implementation of this regulation, i.e. that pipes and wires were laid into the ground for provision of this supply to be utilised upon completion of the unit for occupation. This approach has been based upon the speed of change that currently exists within the electric vehicle metering sector, as well as the very real scenario of a project lifecycle from the acquisition of land right through to the first occupations of properties on a development, and allows for current technology to be connected to existing underground infrastructure upon occupation. This, of course, also avoids the age-old problems we see with out-of-date connections in other utility sectors, such as fibre provision. Other concerns raised with this consultation related heavily to the existing supply capacity for new developments taking on board the new requirement for the Future Home Standard, as well as this new requirement for electric vehicle charging points, which could lead to an exponential rise on per dwelling electrical consumption. This in turn leads to increased costs of electrical capacity infrastructure, as well as introducing further requirements for primary and secondary substations, which will of course impact on development coverage and layout. All of these concerns and more were set out in the HBF response to the consultation, and in a similar vein to the Future Home Standard, we now await a categoric statement on the likely implementation date of the new building regulation, as well as the intended transitional arrangements of this new building regulation. Albeit, we do anticipate that this is likely to be brought into play by spring 21, based upon the timeline set out by MHCLG. So moving now to Part B, Fire, the Building Safety Bill and Cladding. In the tall building sector, it's now just over 3 years since the tragic events that took place at Grenfell Tower. In this time, in addition to the Hackett Review, we've seen sweeping changes and improvements to the regulations designed at maintaining adequate fire protection to buildings, as well as proposed overhauls of the entire statutory approval process for buildings over 18 metres by the recently published Building Safety Bill. This year has seen an update to Part B of the building regulations and has introduced the mandatory requirement for sprinklers in all properties over 11 metres. Further changes to Part B are expected in the coming years, including further reviews in combustible and allowable materials and also height thresholds. Finally, turning to lending and surety against buildings that fall within scope that have been heavily reviewed. New processes being introduced, including the EWS1 form by the RICS, which HBF works centrally with other stakeholders and involved themselves in that, has allowed comfort to developer, lender and occupier alike. It has also provided a new set of rules for buildings in category and in scope as well. The EWS1 form was launched on the 19th of December last year. It's had significant intervention by UK Finance, by developers, by the RICS, MHCLG as well. It's still really in its infancy. We hope to see more government intervention to categorically state scope of these buildings and what is and what is not in scope. And we hope that the next 12 months will give us that surety. Final plug for the HBF Tech Conference, as Andrew mentioned, obviously 16th of September, we have speakers from MHCLG, from RICS, talking about the EWS fund forms. We have Emily Bullman from Ofwat, as well as Matthew Kirkman from OpenReach. And we also have Chris Dore from TriConnex, who's going to be giving a developer side view on the implementation of the electric vehicle charging points. I think that covers my piece now.
That's great. Thank you very much, Kieran. So plenty going on there. I think the issue you mentioned about the EWS1 form for cladding on tall buildings, that's become a live issue now because of how busy the housing market is, people wanting to sell flats and having problems, particularly in London. That's something we're looking at again. There's little we can do in terms of the scope of EWS1. It has been changed once. We lobbied for that. And the numbers of consultants out there is an issue as well, but it's something that Kieran is working on right now. Kieran also touched on changes to building regulations. Obviously, the ones on fire safety have come through during the pandemic, but as Kieran mentioned, we're still waiting for some others. One of those is the detail of the future home standard, and although that's overdue, we're keen to know what the detail will be. It's an area that we're increasingly working on at HBF. I'll just look around the table and see if there's any questions before I move on. I think I'll keep going, Kieran. We can always come back. Just on the future homes piece and the work at HBF, many of you will know that this was anticipated to have been a huge part of our work for this year, working broadly on the environmental agenda, not just on net zero and our ambitions in that area as a country, but also on ecology and biodiversity and so on. So on the 8th of January, which was my first week at HBF, there was a large meeting of some very senior people held in London as a summit to get the ball rolling with regards to what's needed. What's really needed is a roadmap. We need a way to understand all of the various parts of the things that I've just mentioned and how we can move forward sensibly. And that's in the context of the challenges of the future home standard and indeed changes to Part L. So we brought those people together. Inevitably, that work that was planned has to be postponed. The project plans moved to the right. We're anticipating bringing people together in some pretty big workshops, which at the time we would never have thought that we could do through video conferencing. But of course, that's exactly what we are doing now. We know how to do it. So that work is back up and running. We've established a Future Homes task force. And I'll now hand over to John Slaughter just to give you a bit more information about that group, how it plays into other activities for the remainder of the year, and how we're proposing to produce a report by the end of 2020. Over to you, John.
Okay, thanks, Neil, and good morning, everybody. It's good to see you virtually. We're doing a lot of work on this environmental agenda now, and perhaps it's just worth taking a step back to say why are we doing this? I think I would say that the whole economy, the whole of society faces some big environmental challenges, which, notwithstanding the pandemic, the government is actually still very focused on, and which I think we'll be hearing a lot about during the coming year in the run-up to the big so-called COP26 climate change conference that's being held in the UK next November. That's likely to be a big focus of public attention. So environmental challenges are big for everyone, but I think housing in many ways faces particular challenges because it connects with a lot. And in the work that we've done so far that Neil's talked about, then we're looking not just at the buildings themselves, but we're looking at the kind of infrastructure that supports housing delivery and how that relates to environmental objectives and what kind of infrastructure we need in order to achieve good environmental outcomes. And we're also looking at the wider natural environment, the impact of development on that wider natural environment, but also how you can integrate good outcomes for the environment with new development. And the premise for our work, of course, is that we want to deliver the housing the country needs, but also respond to the environmental challenges that are out there and be proactive about that. So as Neil says, we held a very successful summit in January that had widespread participation, not just from the home building industry, but from other sectors of the economy, from manufacturers, from government, from regulators, from NGOs and professional bodies. So we had a very, very broad church of people. and it was very positive in terms of supporting the objective of developing a housing and environment roadmap for the future that Neil talked about. And we were set to launch a big work programme on that just at the time that the pandemic and the lockdown struck. And it frankly hasn't been possible during that period to take it forward, but we are now picking it up. The task force has been formed, as Neil said. We actually had the first meeting of the task force yesterday. And it's maybe worth giving a kind of very quick flavour of the initial steer that we got from that. I think it's fair to say that everybody involved strongly supports the objective of having a coherent plan or roadmap on the environmental objectives. And by that, we're looking at what are the priority issues we need to cover, what are the timelines for achieving particular objectives, and who needs to do what by when, those kind of issues. I think it's fairly clear that carbon and climate change is absolutely central to this, and everyone pretty much said that. But also we need to have a strong focus on the natural environment, on water, and the kind of environments, the kind of developments and the lifestyle and living that we will be creating for people in the future. But there's certainly a view that we shouldn't overstretch, that we should be practical and focused on what is actually deliverable. So some really quite helpful guidance, I think, from the task force yesterday about how we take this forward. And so we'll now be starting a more detailed work programme over the next few months with research, with workshops that we will now hold that we couldn't hold in the spring. We're having a second summit event on the 23rd of September where we'll look to publicly launch the task force around that, and we'll be putting together a report by the end of the year looking at recommendations for the roadmap, but also on a potential body to oversee future activity and delivery of the roadmap. And that's something that we'll want to talk to you about as we go through that process. And just finish, I think, by saying that our view as HBF remains that it's important to be proactive in this area, given the scale of the challenges and the likely focus they will get, notwithstanding the pandemic. Very happy to answer any questions about that.
Thanks, John. That's great. Any questions for John? Any hands up on the environmental agenda? And it still remains vitally important. There's so much to do in this area, and I think until we can get our arms around all the challenges across the various areas, that the domains, as John calls them, that we've mentioned, I think we'll be on the back foot. So we need to be moving this work forward and setting out an ambition for the industry and driving it forward. Okay, no questions for John, so I'll keep moving. Remarkably, we're bang on time. So thanks to everybody who's presented, John, and all the presenters who have gone before. So there are two HBF colleagues left to speak today. The first of those, I mentioned her earlier on, it's Jenny Herdman, who runs the Home Building Skills Partnership. Over to you, Jenny.
Apologies, I went on to mute as the slide came up. As you can see, those are our key achievements in our work in the last year, which I'd like to quickly run you through. Our hugely successful free bricklayer masterclass has enabled NHBC to train almost 5,000 bricklayers around the problem areas they currently find during inspections. And combining this with over 500 site managers trained on defect prevention courses, we're looking to produce improvements in build quality. We're also considering the longer term and taking this training into colleges and using it as continued professional development for lecturers. This training links into the 12 skills frameworks we've produced, identifying the competencies required for key site-based job roles. We've developed a virtual visitors card at the request of HBF members to replace the expired CSCS visitors card for non-construction related roles. If your company isn't using this card yet, you'll find more information on it on the HBF website. We had started to develop different supportive pathways to increase diversity into home building, and 33 women and 161 further education students have taken advantage of this. Unfortunately, this has been subject to CITB funding issues and has been paused. So our £1.9 million grant, we're waiting to hear if this will be reinstated next April. More generally, our social media attraction campaign has home builders collaborating together, all using our social media toolkits at the same time to promote the same message, be that our Sound of Home Building video or that it's Apprenticeship Week. The work we do around mental health continues to grow, and many companies are delivering awareness courses virtually, with over 50 HBF members involved, and a third of the 700 mental health first aiders trained are site-based. We're also proud to have raised over £200,000 for the Lighthouse Club construction charity. Looking forward to next year, we have two exciting new projects. Firstly, a future talent network. Until now, our typical focus has been on attracting people into the home building industry, but it's also vitally important that we develop and retain talent already in the workforce. And we need to grow our young workforce and new entrants to make them so we will link with the Future Talent Network with the Future Talent Conference, which we've been running for a number of years, and also draw on both HBF and industry knowledge, expertise and insight to help individuals develop their chosen career path. Membership will be open to your graduates and the rising talent who've joined the home building sector recently, and more details will be sent out this autumn, and the Future Talent Network will be launched in January 2021. We've also been developing a skills tracker, and when we launched the Home Builders Virtual Visitors Card in December, it was always our intention to expand the virtual skills card into a family that would be used against the competencies of job roles. We've changed this idea slightly now, and HBF are working with CSCS and CITB to track onto the CSCS card real-time details of skills and competencies identified in our skills frameworks. The ambition is that this will cover all site personnel, regardless of if they're a subcontractor or an employee, and also irrespective of where and how the training was completed. The skills tracker will allow us to better understand the competencies of the workforce and identify skills gaps in training needs, but also should provide evidence against requirements of policy or regulatory measures, which the Hackett Review of Building Safety is one example. And of course, next year, we also hope to recommence our Pathways into Home Building and Brick Masterclass projects if CITB give us the go-ahead. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Jenny. That's great. Thanks for that. Thanks for that update. The work of the Home Building Skills Partnership has been key for a few years now. I'm really excited. But it's clearly great to see the delivery, the numbers you have on your chart there, Jenny, about training bricklayers and so on. There's some quite impressive numbers. But I think leading the agenda on issues such as mental health and future talent is absolutely key for our industry in terms of becoming and being perceived to be a more modern industry. We'll be driving that forward. You touched on the CITB funding. There are a few things I didn't expect this year. When I joined HBF, I didn't expect the coronavirus pandemic. When I woke up this morning, I didn't expect to be chairing this event in place of Stewart, and I certainly didn't expect CITB to, having worked so hard to get that funding, for them to stall on that. But we'll find out in the next few weeks about getting that large programme of work, which I think is really key, back up and running again. So we're awaiting that news from CITB. And I know from those conversations and speaking to their chairman that they really value the work that the Home Building Skills Partnership does through the funding that we receive from CITB. Okay, any questions for Jenny? If not, I'll move on to our final speaker today, James Stevens, Director for Cities at HBF, and a familiar face to those of you who attend regional meetings as well, because James coordinates all of those on behalf of HBF as well. So James, after James, I will hand back to me, and then we'll hand it on to Stewart, who will summarise and maybe take any final questions. But over to you for now, James.
Thank you, Neil, and good morning, everybody. So I'm just going to give you a brief update on what's happening in the world of devolution in England at the moment, and try and explain to you why that could be important for the future of planning for housing. So at the moment, we have now 10 combined authorities created in England, plus the Greater London Authority. The most recent of the new combined authorities to be created is the West Yorkshire Combined Authority, which includes the cities of Leeds, Bradford and Wakefield. And it has consulted recently with its public on its devolution deal and will be voting for its first mayor next May, as indeed will be a lot of the other combined authorities. Their elections will be taking place next May. A lot of them, 6 of them, were postponed from this year. So nearly all the people of our major cities in England are now represented by metro mayors. And this is for those who don't know, this is a 2-tier model of local government where you have a combined authority on top led by an elected mayor who is able to exercise certain specific powers and supported by local authorities on the lower tier. And at the moment, it's about 1 in 4 of all people in England is now represented by a mayor. And it definitely was the previous government's favoured model of local government organisation. The devolution white paper, we had expected this to be published last spring, but it was delayed because of the pandemic. This is now going to be rebadged as a local recovery and devolution white paper. That new title gives you an indication of where the priorities of the current government lies. They see the process of devolution as one that needs to be carefully managed and harnessed to aid economic recovery. So what might we expect to see in this white paper when it is published later on in the autumn? Previously, most of the commentary on this thought that we might see the creation of more combined authorities, and we would see a levelling up of powers conferred upon those local authorities to a level currently enjoyed by Greater Manchester, which is the most mature of all the combined authorities. It has the most discretionary powers. And the last government had signalled that this would be this was its intention. And why are we interested then in the devolution, what the devolution white paper might say? Well, it could be because it could extend significantly housing powers, housing budgets, and also spatial plan making powers to all the combined authorities. Not all the combined authorities have those plans at the moment. It's very much a mixed approach. However, it seems that the government's support for strategic planning conducted by combined authorities has cooled somewhat, which hasn't really been helped by the continual delays to the Greater Manchester Spatial Framework, or the Mayor of London's decision to use his spatial plan to conduct what was effectively a kind of proxy war on central government. And we've also seen how the politicisation of metro mayoral government during the pandemic has kind of also added to the government's kind of misgivings about the ability of combined authorities to deliver and take the lead on housing. So while it is possible that we will still see the announcement of the creation of perhaps 1 or 2 more combined authorities in the white paper, it's unlikely that this will still be the government's kind of favoured form of local government reorganisation. I think it's probably more likely that the government will look to the reorganisation of local government through the formation of 1 or more unitary authorities. There has been speculation that it could sort of create up to 25, but this isn't a process that the government really wants to impose on local authorities at the moment. It wants to come to this voluntarily. And of course, that process has been accelerated by the deteriorating rate of local government finances, which has been made more pressing by the fall in business rates as a consequence of the pandemic. The formation of unitary authorities then, while primarily about saving money and improving efficiency, there might be another benefit for us in terms of planning for housing. It has often been observed that the current disaggregated approach to planning in this country, in which you have 250 smallish local authorities, and those are the ones outside of combined authority structures at the moment, but those 250 tend to operate in isolation. and this has left unresolved the problem about how you deal with large unmet housing needs that have accumulated in many local authority areas, especially where you have very extensive historic and environmental designations. And that's a moot point when you actually have a read closely of what the planning white paper is saying about how you, its proposals for how you cater for meeting housing needs. So larger planning units based upon more unitary authorities, fewer local authorities, planning over a wider geography would potentially make it easier to solve that problem. And there is some expectation that we will see the announcement of more unitary authorities in that devolution white paper. So I think there are things to look out for on the devolution front. I don't think it's just a dry topic as far as we're concerned in terms of reorganisation of local government. I think it could have some quite interesting and beneficial implications for planning for housing in this country. Thank you.
Thanks, James. That's great. Don't see any questions there, so I will, just about on time, hand back over to Stewart, and just to say thank you for all of our speakers. You can see we've covered a great deal there, and the word pandemic must have been mentioned scores of times, and no mention of Brexit. We'll maybe leave that for Stewart and for his closing remarks and his AGM speech. But over to you, Stewart.
Well, thank you, Neil. Thank you, everybody, and thanks to the team. A pretty interesting whistle-stop tour of a bunch of issues there. And of course, you know, these things are not easy to do by Zoom. I appreciate it, and I'm sorry if it was a little bit more us talking to you and you not being able to engage with us by comparison with how we normally do these things. I'm not going to say too much about Brexit, other than to say that I was asked on a conference call presentation I was doing, a sort of question I wasn't necessarily expecting at the very end of it. Somebody said to me, what are you looking forward to most when the coronavirus pandemic is over? And I had literally 5 or 10 seconds to think about it. And I said, you know what I'm really looking forward to most? I never thought I'd say these words, is that we'd actually get back to talking about Brexit again. Because if we do, I thought at the time, the coronavirus pandemic will be behind us. As the events of the last few days have proven, both Brexit and coronavirus are able to dominate the news headlines at the same time, and I suspect will do so throughout the balance of this year as we run down towards the clock ticks towards December the 31st. So that's the end of the members' briefing. Thank you very much indeed to everybody for attending. As I said at the outset, you don't need to tune out or tune back in, because the AGM will be on the same channel at 12 o'clock, which is in about 7 or 8 minutes from now, but we will just pause for breath to give those of us of a certain age the opportunity to visit the restroom facilities, as they say in America, the bathroom facilities, as we say here, and maybe refresh our cups. And we'll be back promptly at the top of the hour for what I think will be a relatively quick and hopefully uneventful AGM. Thanks very much. See you in about 7 minutes. So good afternoon. I think we've just gone after 12 o'clock, and I hope that everybody can hear me clearly. If you can't, I'm sure somebody on my team will very quickly let me know. And welcome to the first ever, and I hope the last, virtual AGF annual general meeting. And thank you very much indeed for those of you who have been with us for the last hour and a half or so during our member briefing. And I'm very well aware that there's a number of people who have joined us, as you always do, just for the AGM. Unfortunately, it's not going to be an AGM followed by a situation where I can offer to buy you all lunch or even a drink, because regretfully we're unable to do that in person this year, but hopefully next year we'll be able to rectify that. So I'm here in my virtual office, and I've been joined in a suitably distanced fashion by our non-executive director, Neil Fitzsimmons. So we're here, and we are just going to go through now the process of the annual general meeting and make sure we cover all the business that we need to cover, starting with asking anybody if they have received, or just confirming everybody's had the notice of the meeting, which I'm sure you have, because if you hadn't, you wouldn't be here. And equally, making sure everybody was comfortable with that. If anybody isn't comfortable with that, then you have the ability to raise your hand or scream at me or anything else you want to do over the Zoom network. I can't see anything, so I'm going to move on to the minutes of the meeting that we held on the 8th of May 2019, which when I reviewed them the other day, you know, seemed like a different world ago, but nonetheless, I think do represent an accurate reflection of those minutes. Does anybody have any questions on those minutes, any issues with anything on those minutes, or anything they want to raise around those minutes. If not, and I can't again see or hear anybody coming online, then let's move on to item 3 of the agenda, which is the business review, which I'm going to lead on, and then I'm going to hand over to Mark to talk about the finances. So, whilst clearly conducting an AGM like this is not the same as being able to talk to you all face to face, I am at least grateful that we've still had the opportunity to hold this meeting, albeit much later in the year than usual, as it gives us an opportunity to reflect on the events of last year. But before we turn our attentions back to 2019, I think it's only right to start by addressing the seismic challenges we've all had to face this year due to the ongoing coronavirus pandemic. Whilst the disruption that has been caused has been significant, frankly more significant than almost anything I can record in my lifetime, I'm extremely proud of the way that both the HBF, the team at HBF, the team at HBM, and the team at the Skills Partnership, the entire staff, and the industry quickly adapted and responded to what has become the new normal. As work came to a halt on building sites right across the country, as the lockdown period got underway at the end of March, we made it our business to ensure that our members were kept up to speed with the latest developments. That was critical to us, and as such, we quickly developed a new, more flexible, more nimble way of working. We introduced a new daily coronavirus briefing and developed a new resource page for the HBF website. And working with you, with members across the country, and also with people at government at MHCLG, we developed a charter for safe working practices and protocols for the reopening of sales offices, allowing the industry to return to site gradually, but most importantly, safely from mid-May onwards. And I'm delighted from the feedback I've been given by a number of you that all of these resources have been so useful to you. And it goes without saying that as we enter the next phase of the coronavirus pandemic, we will make sure that you're kept fully up to speed in the months and weeks ahead. And I'd also like to take this opportunity to thank you, our members, and others who are not here but around the country have taken part in helping us to make sure we can do our best to help you. Your willingness to attend virtual meetings, often at short notice, and share your thoughts and concerns has enabled us to represent you most effectively in all of our conversations right across government, whether it's with Number 10, the Treasury, CLG, Homes England, or the Business Department. And yet again, it's a demonstration that by working together, we've been able to secure measures from government to support the industry's recovery, including improved access for builders, particularly small builders, to coronavirus support packages, albeit I know that's been a fraught area, an extension to the practical completion deadline for Help to Buy, extensions to planning permissions, and the recent stamp duty holiday, all items we discussed with members of the government. And I was also extremely proud of the industry's response to HBF's PPE campaign for the NHS, which has provided vital equipment to healthcare workers in their time of need. Whilst clearly the full implications of the coronavirus pandemic are still to be felt, and it will probably be many years before we know for certain how it's going to pan out, I know that by continuing to work together collaboratively, we're capable of weathering any storm that comes our way. But if coronavirus is the defining feature of 2020, I think 2019 will inevitably be remembered for one thing and one thing alone: Brexit. Given the events of the past 6 months, 2019 seems an age ago. But as I reflected on what happened last year, I was reminded of the political paralysis that ensued for much of the year as the then Prime Minister Theresa May tried repeatedly to secure Parliament's backing for the government's withdrawal agreement. As a consequence, there was little parliamentary time available for anything other than Brexit. But we knew deep down that the situation would eventually resolve itself. It had to reach some form of conclusion. And therefore, we continued to progress our work in key policy areas, many of which we touched on in the members' meeting a few moments ago, so that we were ready to respond for when attentions turned back, as inevitably they would, to domestic politics, and with it the return of home building to the policy spotlight. Let me just reflect on a few of the items that dominated our agenda last year. We talked just now about Help to Buy, and David O'Leary gave you a very comprehensive update. As you heard, Help to Buy has been a key driver of the industry's ability to increase housing output by virtually double over the last 5 to 6 years. And you'll also be aware that the scheme coming in next April has caused us some concerns. This is a scheme which will be limited to first-time buyers and also see the introduction of regional price caps, which in our judgment have not been terribly well thought through. And thus we have made those points to government by analysing the potential impact of the implementation of regional price caps. And although we haven't had any success to date, we will continue engaging with them. And as you heard, it will form part of our submission to the comprehensive spending review. The quality of new homes has been a discussion point for a number of years, and so it won't come as a surprise to hear that this issue was again one of our biggest focuses in 2019. Our industry-leading customer satisfaction survey shows scores progressing well, but government has continued to reiterate its commitment to overseeing the introduction of a new homes ombudsman. And this is an agenda which we've been working on for some years, all the way back to that APPG that was published on the day that Theresa May assumed the Prime Minister's role back in July of 2016. And we've been pushing and working very hard to develop an industry-led voluntary solution. And the subsequent launch this year of the Independent New Homes Quality Board that Steve Turner told those of you at the members briefing about an hour or so ago, will, we believe, deliver the government's objectives of improved quality and strengthened consumer redress in a way that is workable for the industry. And at this point, I'd just like to pay tribute and thanks to Stephen Stone, our fellow board director at HBF, for chairing the group that has led the way on this whole issue throughout the past 4 years. Stephen, thank you very much, and indeed to all members of that group, thank you for all your hard work and support. As many of you will know, the environment rapid challenge rapidly shot up the agenda of the public, media, and policymakers in 2019, and it's already clear it will be a major focus for government as it looks to drive a post-corona economic recovery. The scale of the challenge cannot be underestimated, given there are a broad range of issues that the housing industry will need to address, including the Future Home Standard, biodiversity net gain, and electric vehicle charging points, to name just a few. Delivering on the government's ambition to reach net zero emissions by 2050 requires collaboration with numerous sectors, both within and outside of home building. And that's why, as Neil mentioned, we held HBF's first Housing and Environmental Summit, which I was delighted to chair, back in January 2020, which brought together all relevant stakeholders to start to plot a cohesive, comprehensive, and collaborative pathway to achieving net zero carbon homes. Coronavirus has inevitably caused delays to that work, along with much else, but it is, as you heard, beginning again in earnest, and I'll be chairing our second summit on the 23rd of September in just 2 weeks' time. Before I leave the environment, I just wanted to focus a little bit more on future homes. I don't think the importance of the Future Home Standard can be overstated in any way. After all, it will shape the way we design, build, and occupy homes for years, possibly generations to come. And consequently, we spent a considerable period of time developing our response to the consultation which the government launched. We submitted that at the start of this year after one of the most comprehensive discussions amongst the membership that I can recall. And as you heard from Kieran, we're still awaiting the government's response, which has again been delayed by coronavirus activities. Now, it wouldn't be an HBF AGM or indeed any other kind of HBF meeting if I didn't touch on planning. And whilst the 2019 general election delayed the publication of the government's planning white paper until August of this year, that doesn't mean that 2019 was a quiet year for Andrew and his team. Indeed, from the publication of the housing delivery test results to the strong emphasis on design and beauty through the Building Better, Building Beautiful Commission, there were a number of proposals and findings and ideas for colleagues and members to grapple with. And of course, this is only going to increase throughout the remainder of this year and into next year as we start to unpick the government's vision, planning for the future. As Jenny told you, 2019 was also a year of significant progress concerning the Home Building Skills Partnership, which the HBF board agreed we should formally integrate into the HBF organisation, as the initial CITB seed funding is coming to an end. Put crudely, we see skills as something that HBF would always be involved with. It's vital to the industry. It's as crucial to the industry as the involvement that we have in planning and technical and economic and environmental issues. And at this point, I'd also just like to pay tribute and thank the outgoing chairman of the Skills Partnership and my fellow HBF board director, John Tutt, for his sterling work helping to get the skills partnership off the ground. John, thank you for everything. I know John stood down a little earlier this year, and Neil Jefferson has taken on that role, and I'm sure will lead the skills partnership very well in the future. During 2019, the partnership was awarded £1.9 million as part of the CITB's Pathways into Construction initiative, designed to attract new entrants into the industry from underrepresented groups such as women, students, service leavers, and those not in employment, education, or training, more commonly known as NEETs. This work has stalled temporarily due to CITB funding restrictions during the pandemic, but we very much hope it will be back up and running next year. And through the partnership's work and the Future Talent Conference, which we've been holding every year for younger members over the past few years, we identified that there is an interest amongst our members to establish an active network for young professionals and managers who may be the industry leaders of tomorrow. And so I'm very pleased to announce that in 2021, we will be expanding the networking opportunities to our members, launching the Future Talent Network aimed at your management recruits. The Future Talent Network will provide online knowledge and support with professional development and networking opportunities, and we will send you more details later in the year. One of the actions I was personally most proud of in 2019 was the launch of the HBS Mental Health Awareness Campaign. It is a shocking statistic that every working day, 2 construction workers take their own lives, and it is vital that as an industry we take steps to protect the mental well-being of our workforce. So far, the campaign has helped to raise awareness of the issue, break down the stigmas associated with mental health, and provide members with the skills to support their colleagues. And in addition, we've raised some £230,000 so far for the Lighthouse Club, the construction industry charity that we support. Time has only permitted me to give you a very brief overview of some of our activities from last year, and of course there are many more that I could mention. Leasehold reform, building safety devolution, the nitrates issue in the Solent, now spreading to other parts of the country, modern methods of construction, diversity and inclusion, industry-led alternatives to help to buy. The list goes on, and frankly the list of issues that we face goes on and continues to grow with every year. And all of these challenges are set out and covered in our annual review, which I'm delighted to say is available, and even though it's a little later than usual, will be in your inbox later today, and sets out in detail the activities of HBF throughout 2019. Whilst it's inevitable that unforeseen situations will sometimes occur, hopefully we won't ever have to face anything quite so disruptive and damaging as the coronavirus pandemic has undoubtedly been. However, even in such unprecedented times, we've demonstrated as an industry that by working together, we can overcome even the most difficult obstacles. So that concludes my opening remarks. We're now going to move on to finance, but before I do so, I just want to check that anybody, or check whether anybody does have any questions, and I seem to have lost my chat facility at the moment, but I can see there may be some questions there. Neil, can you see those?
Yeah, there's nothing there, Stuart. There's no new questions.
Okay, thank you very much indeed. So without further ado, therefore, I'm going to hand over to Mark Thackstone for a quick skim through our financial accounts for the last year.
Good afternoon. In this session, I'll run through the statutory accounts for 2019, highlighting some key areas. For the second year running, the accounts have been prepared on a consolidated basis, which include the main income generating entities of Home Building Federation and House Builder Media. The surplus after tax for the group resulted in being 493,000, with HBM contributing 262,000 of the total. The final result for 2019 has not significantly changed from 2018. Subscription income, the 3.8 billion, improved by 211,000 compared to the previous year, with full membership contributing 168,000 to this increase. This was achieved by attracting 15 new full members and applying the most recent revenue information from members to an unchanged fee scale. In total, membership increased by 21 to close at 379. Trading income of 1.6 million did not significantly change from the previous year. However, other income reduced by 272,000 compared to 2018. This was mainly due to timing of CITB funding that relates to the Home Building Skills Partnerships activities. In terms of the balance sheet, fixed assets increased by 115,000. This increase is mainly attributable to HBF investing almost £100,000 in a new CRM system to improve internal efficiency and communication with its members. This and other movements within the balance sheet reduced the bank by 78,000, but it still remains a significant part of the balance sheet at over 4.5 million. In terms of the current year, this year has been fueled with uncertainty. However, membership continues to grow. At present, this stands at 388 with extremely high collection levels. Naturally, working from home and working in a virtual environment has created savings, but also HBF as a group has experienced cancellation of key events. Like most businesses, we've had to reforecast and examine our cost base. And as a result, with careful management, we are encouraged by HBS finances leading up to the end of 2020. So that concludes the finances for 2019. Thank you.
Thank you, Mark, and appreciate the quick update. Does anybody, we did send you a link to the full accounts, and I'm sure several of you have read that in full, as I know you always do every year. Does anybody have any specific questions either for Mark or more generally surrounding the accounts? If so, again, I'm struggling with mobile technology to see anybody other than Mark at the moment, but I'm assuming because no one's telling me that there is anything, I can take that as read and move on to item 4 of the agenda, which is some revisions to our Constitution and Articles of Association, which I'm going to ask Neil to explain to you briefly. Neil?
Thanks, Stuart. Yeah, good afternoon, everybody. Just to say that in the inbox when I arrived at HBF was a job of updating HBF's Constitution, Articles of Association. I won't go through all the detail. It's quite a laborious process that Mark and I have been through. We instructed Field Seymour Parks LLP, FSP, to do this work on our behalf. We provided the updated articles and Constitution. If you've got any questions or any problems with the link, please do let me know. In a nutshell, there's not too much to get excited about. Of course, if there was something today that was significant with regards to members of HBF, we'd be telling you. But essentially what we did was to update both the articles in Constitution in line with current laws. There were some quite old references in there which needed to be updated. One of the reasons we really needed to change both the articles and the Constitution, of course, was to allow for the provision of today's meeting to be held as a virtual conference. The government has introduced legislation this year which does allow for these arrangements, but actually the changes we've made mean that we can do this in future years as well, so that's quite important. The one area that was maybe slightly confused was the clarification over who are the statutory members of HBF. Those are the board directors, and we've created through the articles a more automated approach to joining as a statutory member and leaving as a statutory member as on resignation from the board of HBF. So that's quite helpful as well from the company secretary point of view. And equally, in terms of the separate document, which is the bylaw Constitution, no major changes there. We did remove a reference to an organisation, HBF, which is different to HBF Limited and is an artefact of the past, a legacy issue, and tidied that up in terms of modern practice. So if there are any questions, I'm happy to take any now, or it may be appropriate for those to be handled outside of this meeting. But these particular changes don't require a vote today. There's no resolution. In fact, the board and the statutory members have already approved those changes at 2 prior board meetings, and they've the details are winging their way to Companies House. So that was it, Stuart. And you're on mute.
I'm caught out by the phrase of 2020, which is that I'm on mute. Do we have a question coming? Not urgent now, apparently, so we'll deal with it separately. So I think if anybody's got any particular questions surrounding the Articles of Association or our Constitution, I'm very happy to take those perhaps away from this meeting. And as you would have gathered, Mr. Jefferson, having joined us in January, is now somewhat of an expert on this subject, and I'm sure he'd be delighted to speak to any of you at any time about it. A couple of things we do need you to approve are items 5 and item 6, if I just move down the agenda. And we're going to use something called Zoom poll for this. So Kathy will make, there it is, by the wonders of science, you have now the chance to vote, first of all, in respect of item 5, which is the ratification of the chairman and the directors of the board of HBF Limited for the next 12 months. And in accordance with clause 10 of the articles and clause 7 of the Constitution, Stephen Stone offers himself for re-election. So could I ask you to vote now? All those in favour and all those against. You just have to press the button, I think, and do so. And hopefully the technology will tell us that you're doing so, and we will get an instantaneous result, although I'm not getting any kind of result on my screen, Kathy. I don't know whether you can, if you can see anything. In favour, Neil, can you tell me the results?
Yeah, I can tell you that's been voted for by 100% in favour.
Very good. Well, I'm delighted about that. Not as delighted as Stephen Stone is, but nearly as delighted as Stephen Stone is. And then we move on to item 6, which is consideration of the reappointment of Barnes Roffe LLP as auditors to HBF at the remuneration to be agreed by the Board of HBF Ltd, the usual clause that we put in here every year, but we require you to formally approve that, please, if you'll be kind enough to do so by voting in favour. And of course, if any of you do not agree, then we will please say no, and please vote now if you'd be so kind. And again, I can't see the results coming in, but I'm assuming that that's also received unanimous approval.
Kathy? It is unanimous, 100%. Thank you, Stuart.
Thank you very much. So before I come to any other business, I'm aware there's a couple of people who want to say a couple or ask a couple of questions, I think, or raise some issues. If I may, just a few thank yous. First of all, to Kath, as you will have gathered, our IT wizard has been working in the background, making today possible. And Kathy, I think it's gone extremely well. It's always inevitable when you do these things, you have some teething problems, but I have to say from where I've been sitting, it's appeared to have gone very smoothly. So thank you to that. I'd also like to thank everybody who's attended, but also all members all around the country, not all of whom can attend, of course, for your support today, but also your support throughout the entire year. And particularly, as I said earlier, during these very difficult last 6 months, which have been troubling, to say the least, for all of us to have to navigate. I touched earlier on when we're at our best, when HBF is at its best, and I think we're clearly at our best when we act as a conduit between you and government and other key influencers. And we're only as good, frankly, as the intelligence that you provide us with, which we then take away and make the appropriate representations to ministers, officials, and others. And thank you so much for everything that you've done. I'd also like to thank all of those who populated our committees. I mentioned a couple, the Skills Committee, the Home Building Skills Partnership, to be more accurate, and also the group that's been looking at the quality agenda and the Ombudsman. But we have numerous other committees, and there are, I'm afraid, just too many for me to mention individually, and it would take us right the way through lunch if I did. But just to let you know that we really do appreciate the time you give up and the dedication that you put into helping us make sure those committees are successful in their work as well. And also, I'd like to mention a special thank you from me to the board of directors of HBF. I think most of whom are on, Gerald Walton's away, but most of the rest are on the call today. And I won't list them all individually, but thank you for all your help. And in particular, thank you for your wise counsel. You know, leading a trade body like this is a combination of making sure we represent people properly, but also from time to time we have to take on board that things are happening in the environment and other areas which require leadership. And I'm grateful to you for all the support for the initiatives that we've been running over the last year or so. And finally, I'd like to thank Neil, but also everybody else working at HBF, HBM and the Skills Partnership, wherever you're based, in England or Wales, North, South, East or West. I think Neil has made a real impact since he started in January. He seems to have fitted in like a hand into a glove, possibly because we thought we knew him pretty well, and it's turned out we did. But also because I think he's worked extremely hard at making sure he's integrated the management team and helped move the organisation forward, and has certainly become a true partner to me over the course of the last few difficult months. Frankly, Neil, I think we've worked extremely well steering the HBF through this period, and I thank you and indeed everybody else on the team right across the country for everything that you've done. So all that remains for me is to move to any other business, and I've been told that Andrew Brooks has something he wishes to ask, and I think Steve Midgley as well. But I go to Andrew first. Andrew, if I can patch you in. I don't know whether I can, if you're there.
Can you hear me, Stuart?
I can hear you loud and clear, sir. There you are, in your usual place, if I may say.
Yeah, usual background anyway. I just want to take the opportunity on behalf of all the members to thank you in particular for your leadership this year. But all of the whole of the HBF team in representing our interests in an unprecedented year with a Brexit, with election, coronavirus, and a time of such huge regulatory change as we've heard on 2 meetings already today. You've also had to adopt a new role as facilitator in order for us to be able to share our experiences and kept us updated on a regular basis. And that enabled us to get back as an industry, to return to work in a very safe manner, and probably in a way that none of us would have expected we could do it so efficiently. But it also gives me the opportunity to finally get minuted one of your loose promises at the early part of this, which is that you were offering much better quality wines at our next meeting. And it just gives me the opportunity on behalf of all the members to make sure this is minuted at the AGM. But thank you very much for you and the team. You've represented us well. Thank you.
Andrew, thank you. And you're quite right. I have promised you that as we've not spent the budget on wine, we will not necessarily spend the entire budget, but we will find a little bit more decent wine when we finally manage to get back face to face. And I very much look forward to the opportunity to do that and sharing a decent glass with you. But thank you very much indeed for very kind comments, which are hugely appreciated by us all. And really, thank you very much. Steve Midgley, did you want to add anything?
Well, Andrew said a lot of it there, what I was going to say, but I think really, Stuart, I mean, it's got to be a massive thanks this year to both yourself and Neil and the whole team for the leadership that's been shown throughout this this current year, which is really without precedent. And that's not to say that there was any lack of work before that, because I think the influence that we've developed is extremely high, and a credit to all of you. And whilst I don't really like picking out any individuals, I do really think that I want to mention David O'Leary and Steve Turner this year as having absolutely excelled themselves. So once again, a big thank you to all of you. And yes, don't forget that wine next year.
Well, that's a very good segue, perfectly leading to the fact that I can tell you that the AGM next year is scheduled to be held in London at the Marriott on the 21st of October. Sorry, the 21st of April. I'm jumping ahead of myself. I'm assuming a delay that hasn't happened. 21st of April, 2021. I hope you and others will be able to attend in person, and I hope that I can buy you that decent wine and have a decent lunch with a good speaker, and we'll be back by then to business as usual. So all that remains for me to do is to thank you all very much indeed. I think we've nobody else who wants to come on as far as I can tell. So thank you very much indeed to both Andrew and to Steve for those very kind comments at the end. But thank you also to everybody for attending the last couple of hours. I hope you found it useful and informative as always. As I said, the annual report will be in your inbox a little bit later today. Somebody's already texted me and said that they've seen an advanced copy, and apparently I had rather less hair then than I do now, which is probably not, I'm probably not alone in that respect. But I hope you find that an enjoyable read, and I look forward to catching up with you at the next HBF event. But meanwhile, thank you very much. Good afternoon. Have a good lunch. Take care. Bye-bye.